The following PowerPoint presentation is to accompany Personality, Chapter 2, How is Personality Studied and Assessed? In general, personality can be assessed in one of two different ways. Objective assessment involves measurement that is not dependent on the individual making the assessment. However, subjective assessment is measurement that relies on the interpretation by the individual making the assessment. In personality assessment, we must walk the line between being so objective that our information is sterile and meaningless, and being so subjective that our observation is idiosyncratic and our inference is unscientific. When measuring personality, there are two important aspects to psychological measures which need to be considered. First is the reliability of the measure, and this is the degree to which a given measure assesses a specific behavior consistently. The second is the validity of the measure, and that is the degree to which a given measure actually assesses the specific behavior. First, we will discuss reliability in more detail. Internal consistency reliability is the degree of consistency between subparts or equivalent parts of a test. For example, separate items on a self-report measure. Measurement becomes more consistent and stable as we take repeated relevant measures. In statistical terms, this means that internal consistency is a function of the number of items and the degree of correlation or relationship between these items. Sometimes the consistency issue applies to expert observers. Usually about 12 observers are sufficient to achieve consistency. Test-retest reliability is the degree of consistency between the results of the same test taken in different occasions at two different time points. When internal consistency reliability and test-retest reliability are both high, we know we are measuring something real. We have a reliable personality test. But how can we have a reliable, that is stable, assessment of personality if personality may change or be influenced by the situation? Well, personality consists of patterns of behavior that dramatically direct activity. Although a person's particular activities and daily responses may change, the basic underlying patterns remain relatively stable. We should ascertain the individual's patterns of response over time, and these consistent patterns will emerge. In personality testing, we need to allow that personality may change over the long term or after a major trauma, and to expect personality stability only over shorter periods of perhaps several years. People grow and change, and even their basic patterns of responding may change. Now we will discuss validity in more detail. Construct validity is the extent to which a test truly measures a theoretical construct. For example, charismatic people should score higher on a test of charisma than non-charismatic people. But they should also do more than just simply score high on this paper and pencil measure. They should engage in certain charismatic activities, and they should show a certain pattern of responses on other measures. Construct validation is an ongoing process and involves two other types of validity. Convergent validity is the extent to which an assessment is related to what it should be related to, or other measures that measure the same behavior. Discriminant validity is the extent to which an assessment is not related to what it should not be related to, or that is, measures that measure a different behavior or a different construct. Researchers use multiple assessment methods and various traits in order to determine test validity. Content validity is the extent to which a test is measuring the domain it is supposed to be measuring. So it's more specific than construct validity. So for example, a test might seem to be measuring creative ability, but might in fact be measuring only artistic ability and ignoring musical ability, writing ability, and other aspects of creative ability. And finally, criterion-related validity is the extent to which an assessment predicts outcome criteria, such as do aptitude tests predict future job performance? Items are the separate statements or questions on an assessment measure. And we need to consider certain factors of the items when constructing a personality measure. First, the items should be clearly written and relatively simple, that is, easy to understand. Another desirable quality of a test item is that it should discriminate among test takers. An item is useless if everyone answers it in the same way. So, generally speaking, each item in an assessment should divide the group of test takers into roughly two groups: those who are high in the trait or behavior being assessed, and those who are lower in the trait or behavior being assessed. With this said, each group should vary, that is, show a range of scores. So, in total, the sample scores should have a relatively normal distribution. Also relevant is that all the items should be intercorrelated. That is, the responses on each item should be similar for each participant, and each item is measuring some aspect of the same overall construct. When measuring personality, we need to be aware of bias. One type of bias is that of the participants in response sets. And a response set is a bias in responding to test items that is somehow unrelated to the personality characteristic being measured. For example, a couple type of response set biases are, first off, the acquiescence response set, which is a bias in which people are more likely to agree than disagree with anything that's being asked of them. Another response set bias is social desirability, and that is a bias of the participant in which they're likely to want to present themselves in a favorable light or to try to please the experimenter or test administrator. So how do we reduce this bias due to response sets? Well, in addressing the acquiescence response set, it is important to include items that are worded in a reverse direction. One way to deal with the social desirability response set is to present items of equal desirability, or use neutral words that do not show a preference, and ask the test taker to choose between the two. However, sometimes people give purely random answers. For this, some tests may have lie scales, which include items like, I have walked on the moon, yes or no. Such items help pick out liars, or people who aren't paying attention. But of course, as the text says, this may mess up your testing when you test that rare astronaut. However, even a clearly designed personality assessment is subject to various sources of distortion or bias. It is therefore valuable for the personality psychologists to employ multiple means of assessment. And it's also important to note that assessment can have some bias but still be of value. Sometimes there are biases in which a test fails to take into account the relevant culture or subculture of the person being tested. Some tests may be inappropriate because they make certain assumptions about the knowledge and background of the test taker. Tests can be culturally biased or show a gender bias, and should therefore be used only with a certain subset of the population. And the tests are not necessarily bad or worthless. Rather, they must be properly used and interpreted in order to be valid. Personality assessment has meaning only in context, and we should become sensitive to the context of all of our assessments. All too often, tests fail to take into account the relevant culture or subculture of the person being tested. Theories and measures developed in one culture are improperly applied to another culture. And it's difficult to emphasize how subtle and yet how ingrained in our society are such biases. Personality psychology too often studies samples of convenience, that is, one's patients, one's students, one's children, and too rarely makes a systematic attempt to ascertain whether conclusions apply to other people, in other places, and in other times. We will now discuss the variety of ways that personality can be measured. On theoretical grounds, it is apparent that many sorts of tests are more or less appropriate for measuring the aspects of personality under consideration. For example, it does not make sense to ask people to report about their unconscious motivations. By definition, such motivations cannot be consciously grasped or reported. On methodological grounds, it is important to have various ways of measuring personality because each suffers from inherent biases. The weaknesses in one assessment technique can be compensated for by other techniques. They help us achieve a more complete understanding of personality. For example, interviews can probe more deeply and reactively into a person's inner thoughts and feelings than can a standardized self-report questionnaire. Or observations of behavior or the analysis of a person's expressive style are often best at capturing what a person actually does. I will now describe and discuss various types of personality measures. The most common personality tests are dependent on the test taker's self-report, such as the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory. The Q-sort is a method of personality assessment in which a person is given a stack of cards naming various characteristics and is asked to sort them into piles that relate to how relevant each characteristic is to the test taker. The judgments of knowledgeable others can sometimes be an exceedingly effective way to assess personality, and these include ratings by parents, by teachers, by friends, by our spouse, or by psychologists. Our initial impressions of another on certain dimensions, like extroversion, can sometimes be quite accurate. Traits such as extroversion are comparatively easy to judge because they involve relations with others. These activities are readily observable. Some of the greatest progress of recent years on assessing individual differences has come from new biological measures. The brain is specialized into distinct areas, and methods exist that attempt to correlate individual differences in personality with activity in these specialized regions. In the modern study of personality, behavioral observations can be as simple as counting people's experiences, or it can become quite complex as researchers attempt to understand the individual's interactions with others. In a more fine-grained analysis, facial expressions of emotion can be finely and validly observed and coded. Furthermore, the availability of electronic pagers has allowed more complete sampling of behavior. This experience sampling method of assessment is a method in which participants record their current activity or thought processes when they are paged by the experimenter at various intervals during the day. Use of behavioral observation assumes that present behavior is a reliable and valid predictor of future behavior. When an adequate sample of present behavior is collected, this assumption generally does prove true. Interviews. Psychotherapeutic interviews are interviews in which a client talks about the important or troubling parts of his or her life. In recent years, assessment interviews have tended to become more systematic or structured, rather than follow the interviewee's meanderings. The interviewer follows a definite plan. Thus, these structured interviews are systematic interviews in which the interviewer follows a definite plan so that similar types of information are elicited from each interviewee. Expressive style is a term used to describe nonverbal social skills such as vocal characteristics, facial expressions, body gestures, and movements. Often the way people do things is more informative than what they do. Expression, particularly emotional expression, seems closely tied to dynamic, motivational aspects of personality. Document analysis and life stories. Document analysis is a method of assessing personality by applying personality theories to their study of diaries, letters, and personal records. Document analysis and diaries can be focused on more narrow questions and can provide useful data about the personality of those who lived in other times and places. Many insightful biographers rely on the paper trail left by historical figures. Personal writings and musings are very helpful when our assessment can be confirmed by other sources of information. A projective test is an assessment technique that attempts to study personality through use of relatively unstructured stimulus, tasks, or situations. They allow a person to project his or her own inner motivations onto the assessor's test. In addition to drawing a picture, projective tests include telling a story, completing a sentence, or doing word associations. Projective tests seem especially valuable to proponents of psychoanalytic theories because the theories are based on unconscious motivations, and projective tests attempt to capture such motivations. Some examples of projective tests include the Rorschach and the Thematic Apperception Test, or TAT, shown here. Demographic information is information relevant to population statistics such as age, cultural group, place of birth, religion, and the like. In attempting to understand an individual, it is generally helpful to ascertain various sorts of demographic information. All such information relevant to the population statistics helps provide a framework for better understanding the individual. However, by itself, demographic information can be misleading, as in the case of twin brothers who share all the same demographic characteristics, but have different personalities. To gain a good understanding of an individual, we need to know the person's cultural milieu and cultural identity, and this is especially true if the culture is outside the mainstream. But these demographic and cultural groupings are not psychological, and so do not fit smoothly into most personality theories. On the other hand, personality psychologists too often overlook such societal influences. Well, that is how we assess personality, what are some ways not to test personality? Well, it's amazing to see how much time and money some people spend attempting to assess personality in ways that are marginally valid at best. And many are simply frauds or fantasies, such as the use of astrology, palm reading, numerology, bogus religions, or handwriting analysis. As previously stated, personality psychology is a science, and personality research is usually not a straight linear process. Rather, there is frequent backtracking and circling around as ideas are tested and refined. Still, there is a certain logical progression of inference that can be said to underlie this research process. I have posted a video on Blackboard called Research Methods. This video explains the different techniques and type of research methodology that's used in personality psychology. Finally, a word about the ethics of personality testing. In order to help people with psychological and relationship problems, an accurate diagnosis of their problems and their strengths is useful. Thus, fair and valid testing can be beneficial to everyone. But there is always a danger when test results will be wrong due to various limitations. Inaccurate testing will be a major problem if testing is being done to identify people who are less worthy. Unfortunately, just as the first intelligent tests were quickly corrupted to search for morons or idiots, psychological assessment is sometimes used today for purposes of discrimination and persecution. For example, tests might be legitimately designed to screen job applicants, but such a test easily could be biased against those from traditionally less employed groups. It is as if medical diagnosis were being used, not to help in successful medical treatments, but rather to decide who should be shunned as diseased. The real problem is that some personality tests are poorly constructed, improperly used, and wrongly employed. The solution is to ensure that only educated people who are well versed in understanding the valid use and severe limits are allowed to use these personality tests.